final speaker today will be Mikko Lahtinen. He was a senior lecturer at the University of Tampere in Finland and a noted commentator of Finnish political life. His academic work, he's worked mainly in political theory, published extensively in Finnish and in English and other languages on Machiavelli and Renaissance political thought, and on Marxist theory from Marx to Gramsci, Althusser, Delancey, and other figures. He's also in particular published extensively on the history of Finnish nationalism in relation to the formation of capitalism in Finland and class society in the 19th and 20th centuries. His most recent book in English is the book Politics and Philosophy, Machiavelli and Althusser's Auditory Materialism. Today, Mikko will fittingly be finishing the conference with a paper entitled Machiavelli was not a republicanist or a monarchist, Louis Althusser's aleatory interpretation of the prince.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Filippo and Tania and others for this beautiful conference. You have organized this very well. And this is last hour it comes in history. I know this. Future lasts a long time. But I like to talk something about so-called Republican interpretations of Machiavelli and comparing or take a look on Althusser's different kind of reading. In the so-called Republican interpretation of Machiavelli, like in Rousseau or in encyclopedists, like in Diderot, it has been emphasized that Machiavelli's ideal was not enlightened principality, but rather a form of government or a state where the laws would have higher standing than individual persons in positions of power. In other words, the laws would also control the latter. Maybe it would be principe, but anyhow. This interpretation, this Republican interpretation, is not completely refuted by Althusser or Antonio Gramsci. However, both Gramsci and Althusser emphasize the two moments of the states, due momenti di Stato, the second of which could also be called Republican moment, or collective moment as Althusser defines. But in this presentation, my point is that the advantage of Althusser's or Gramsci's, so I can call it these two-stage interpretations, compared to ancient or modern republicanist interpretations, is that Machiavelli's dynamic and conflict-focused view of politics and the state are highlighted. As you already noticed, there is this conflict view on conflict, or dynamic and conflict-focused view of politics. I'm interested in Althusser's or Gramsci's interpretation of Machiavelli. And also, if we think about such commentators of Machiavelli like Neil Wood, he has also emphasized Machiavelli's dynamic and conflict-focused view of politics. I noticed Neil Wood's long introduction to the Machiavelli's The Art of War, published by Da Capo Press, I think, in 1968. It's a very interesting introduction to the Prince, English translation of, not in Prince, but the Art of War, this Neil Wood's interpretation. I was writing last night, and then I go to my paper. I hadn't printer, so I had to read there. Anyhow, even though Althusser or Gramsci does not dispute that Machiavelli's thinking contains obvious Republican tendencies or dimensions, on the other hand, they both emphasize the historical utopian nature of Republican movement. The historical conjuncture or situation on the Apennine Peninsula was such that a move towards the collective moment of republic, and the collective will it required was not possible. There was no occasione for a republic. Before an occasion could occur, it was necessary to go through the moment of solitude of the new prince, as Althusser formulated this thing. Moment of solitude of the new prince. In other words, the organization or reformation of a republic based on the laws necessarily requires, as a form of transition, a prince or legislator who, by means of power, persuasion and cunning, leads the people or multitude of multi towards the republican collective moment. Such an interpretation can also be applied to the following passage from the discourse, maybe the Machiavelli's most republican work. And now I quote Machiavelli's Discorsi. This comes from the book 1, chapter 9. We must assume as a general rule that it never or rarely happens that a republic or monarchy is well constituted or its old institutions entirely reformed unless it is done by only one individual. It is even necessary that he whose mind has conceived such a constitution should be alone in carrying it into the effect. Virtuous legislator of a republic, therefore, whose object is to promote the public good and not his private interest, and who prefers his country to his own successors, should concentrate all authority in himself. The end of quote. In this quote, there are indications that in the case of Machiavelli, what is most essential is not necessarily the differentiation between monarchist or regnio and republican forms of government. This duality is not maybe the most necessary, most important thing, but something else. However, it is essential to note that the difference between the individual moment of founding a republic or a monarchy and the collective moment based on the laws is here very important, as well as whether the individual founder of the republic or monarchy act for the benefit of himself and his family or for the common good. What this means is that, particularly in the moment of solitude, the new prince is alone, also in the sense that only he can interpret the real interest of the people, whereas with the collective moment of the people, with the collective moment, the people gradually learns to understand what their own interests are. They became a people, as Althusser says, devenir peuple, as a political actor in a new kind of state. According to Althusser, the interests of the people are imprinted in the constitution of the state. It is in the constitution that the interests of the people are institutionalized in relation to its class enemy, the powerful nobility, pochi. The law is also the absolute condition for the state's durability and its capacity to expand, because when the state is no longer dependent upon the practice of the prince, it's possible to make state be durable, dure. In other words, the prince has made himself superfluous. This is interesting in Althusser's interpretation. And now I quote Althusser's own text. To the second moment corresponds the metaphor of taking root. This is the concrete, organic moment either of the penetration of the laws, thus decreed into the antagonist social classes, or of the production of laws by popular struggle against the nobles. This rooting of the prince's power in the people by the mechanism of laws is the absolute condition for the state's duration and power. That is to say, its capacity to expand. End of quote. According to Althusser, one should not think on the basis of the second moment that Machiavelli was a Republican, like, for example, Rousseau, Ugo Foscolo, or many other ideologists of the Risorgimento. Even though the second moment describe it in the discourses could be defined as Republican moment. Machiavelli's position there is the same as in the first moment described in The Prince. In both works, Machiavelli discusses the same issue, the conditions for the founding of the durable state. After discussing this, Althusser returns to his viewpoint that Machiavelli's political problem arises from his own conjuncture. As mentioned earlier in my presentation, even though Machiavelli does present in the first 12 chapters of The Prince examples from the antiquity, their purpose is only to support the lessons of the Italian examples of his own time. This feeling of presence here is very important. In these first chapters, Machiavelli carries out an analysis of his own conjuncture by utilizing the analysis of the past cases. His central objective is to assess, in the light of existing and past examples, what kind of new principality would not only be possible, but also a good one. According to Althusser's interpretation, the only suitable alternative in founding a principality is a completely new one, acquired by means of new prince, own weapons of virtue or fortuna. Old principalities simply don't work. They are expressions of the feudal powers, structures, and ways of thinking oriented towards the past, as Althusser indeed states. In this context, Machiavelli's historical utopianism and thinking reaching for the limits of possible, as Althusser formulates. And I quote Althusser, "To aim above all existing principalities beyond their limits, the prince does not pre-exist the new principality. The new principality does not precede the new prince. They must begin together, new prince and new principality. And this beginning is what Machiavelli calls an adventure. This adventure passing from private citizen to ruler." Here, quotation ends. Following Althusser's reasoning, one could think that Machiavelli's viewpoint is completely utopian, particularly when he rejects all the existing alternatives. But it's important to note that Machiavelli's utopianism is defined from the starting point of the existing political conditions, with regard to which no kind of compromise is possible. There are no place for compromise. Furthermore, when Machiavelli speaks about a new prince without actually naming him, uno principe nuovo, uno, non il principe, uno principe nuovo, in the chapter 26, without actually naming him, instead presenting an abstract theory about the encounter of the virtue and fortuna in the prince subject. The anonymity of the prince is not a result of the theoretical process of abstraction, but, and Althusser formulates, the abstract form of the theory is the index and effect of concrete political stance. Quotation ends. Machiavelli left the new prince and principality unidentified, or simply loosely defined, not because these would have stood for anonymous generalizations of existing princes and principalities, but rather because the existing princes or principalities could not offer the components for the definition and identification of the new prince and new principality. So Machiavelli rejects them all on account of their historical impotence, says Althusser. Machiavelli's silence has indeed a positive political meaning. It shows that the future of Italy cannot be built on existing powers, but rather one must reach beyond these borders. Thus, Machiavelli's utopianism is based on the existing effective truth, veritae effettuale della cosa, which he at the same time takes as the object of his subversive critique. Cesare Borgia was for Machiavelli the only example, I think so, the only example or model for the historical new prince. Of course, we can discuss was his only model, but in some philosophical sense, I think he was the only example or model for the historic new prince. According to Machiavelli, Cesare Borgia could have united Italy if an, I quote, extraordinary and inordinate malice of fortune had not befallen him. The advantage of emphasizing the two moments in the foundation of state, as Gramsci and Althusser did, is also that processual and aleatory nature of founding and maintaining a state. Althusser's interpretation emphasized that the state is not a static organization, but a complex process, like Gramsci's new prince, modern prince. Complex process, where the renewal of even the most stable state requires its simultaneous production and reproduction. In other words, in Machiavelli's view, the most central factor is not the state as a fait accompli, but the aleatory nature of the founding and renewing of a state. And we can also make this difference between republicanist and aleatory, so-called aleatory interpretation of Machiavelli by saying as follows. In the republicanist interpretation, the emphasis is on issues sustaining peace and harmony, whereas the so-called, I can say it, aleatory interpretation by Althusser discusses the elements of chance that lie behind peace and harmony, as well as the struggles and conflicts characterized by this aleatory nature of the state. So here comes also this struggle and conflict. It's in the middle of Althusser's, in Machiavelli's thinking. And here Althusser also used this expression, as you already said, l'accumulation primitive politique. With the collective moment of the law and republic, the second moment, the state is no longer merely dependent on the virtue of the prince and the fortunate aleatory encounters, but it can itself endure, as Althusser says. The second moment is the moment of durée. However, not even this can guarantee this republic form, that some surprising event occurring at the wrong moment would still not destroy the state, and at the same time also open up new possibilities for action for those who don't approve of the existing state. Also, this aleatory nature of the state makes possible, can we say, subversive political movement. It opens up revolutionary situations. It opens up also the possibility to destroy state and maybe found a different kind of state or society. History is the, as Althusser formulates, the permanent revocation of the accomplished fact. There one never knows where or how this revocation will occur. And here Althusser encapsulates this in the statement that, and I quote Althusser, one day new hands will have to be dealt out and the dice thrown again on the empty table. And the dice thrown again on the empty table. And here you can notice also that this dramatic form of Althusser's interpretation of Machiavelli. That's why one reason I like to read Machiavelli and ask that because of its dramatic form of interpretation, as Gramsci says about Machiavelli's prince, its dramatic form. And these Althusser's dramatic formulations, literally very interesting also. something about aleatory dynamics and also something something about Quentin Skinner and his interpretation. I think that Althusser manages to open up Machiavelli's dynamic conception of political practice, as I like to call it, better than, for example, those republicanist interpreters of Machiavelli, like, for example, very influential Quentin Skinner. He also has been very influential in very positive sense also in my home country in Finland. But anyhow, I think that Althusser's advantage is this dynamic conception of political practice. The picture that emerges of Machiavelli's thinking is rather different from that found in Skinner's interpretation, which has received much attention in recent decades, since this past master short book on Machiavelli and foundation of modern political thought. Even though Skinner pays attention to the Machiavelli's notion that it is not possible to found a republic in a state of advanced corruption, but rather being liberated from corruption requires the autocratic action of a single person, Skinner does not analyze the logic of political practice, link it with the problematics of corruption and liberation from this corruption. Instead, Skinner concentrates mainly on the end result of the process, namely the republic, and in Machiavelli's republican ideas, which, according to Skinner, is Machiavelli's preferred form of government. But I think that Althusser manages very well, maybe better than Skinner, in getting to grips with the dynamic of political action. This critique may seem strange in relation to Skinner's emphasis on concepts and conceptual changes in political struggles. However, I agree with my countryman Kari Palonen, who has written a monography on Quentin Skinner. He knows Skinner better than Skinner himself. Quentin once told me that Kari knows his thinking better than he himself. Yeah. However, I agree with Kari Palonen, who shows how, and I quote here Palonen, Skinner's interest, even in the conceptual changes, is primary on the rhetorical level. In other words, concerned with the legitimization rather than the explication of conceptual novelties and conflicts, and rather on the level of established language use than the construction of profiled conceptions. This was my own translation of Palonen's Finnish language text, so it was the first time you heard it in English. To this I would add that Skinner's interest is directed at the conceptual rhetorical manifestations of political conflicts and not other kinds of less rhetorical, functional dimensions of conflicts and their logic. By this, I don't mean that rhetoric would not be an essential part of political activity, or that rhetoric would not also exist materially in a material way, but rather that political action is not merely a question of rhetoric, nor must the history of political thinking be analyzed only by means of research methods concerned with rhetoric or conceptual history, Begriffsgeschichte in German language culture. In Althusser's or Gramsci's interpretation, on the other hand, the most essential question does not concern, as I also said, whether or not Machiavelli supported so-called republican or monarchist form of government, or perhaps a combination of the two, but it is more important to analyze the logic of the actions of political actors and groups of the actors than such already fixed forms like republic or principality. Because as I tried to show in my, and as I have tried to show in my book, Peter mentioned my book published first time in Finnish in 1997, and as a translation in English 2009 by Brunel, and now in paperback by Haymarket Books in the States. As I have tried to show in my book on Althusser's Machiavelli, this aim to govern the aleatory reality can be characterized as taming chance, as I follow this expression of Ian Hacking, taming of chance. One historical response to a highly aleatory situation has been to found a republic, or alternatively, a monarchy, or a mixed form of government. Even though not even Althusser or Gramsci denies that Machiavelli's thinking would not include republican elements or preferences, it is more important to pay attention to the conditions of each historical conjuncture, during which the political actions occur and becomes possible. For Althusser, the point is to elaborate the aleatory and case-specific nature of political practice, for instance, in the founding of the new state or form of government. In Althusser's interpretation, Machiavelli's The Prince and his other works are theoretical analyses of aleatory situations and series of events. And understood this way, the problematics of virtue and fortune refer to political action with no guarantee of success. Even though the republican form of government would be the ultimate political goal, the conjuncture does not necessarily offer realistic opportunities for such an attachment. For instance, in Machiavelli's own historical context, the new prince or a new prince and the principality led by him, the foundation of kind of monarchy, was only a weak aleatory possibility. And as we know, Italy united only almost 400 years later, or can we say that Italy has never united? It's still in some aleatory condition. You know better, you're Italians. It's very united Italy. But anyhow, it was only a weak aleatory possibility in the time of Machiavelli. Not a single existing city-state, prince or principality had what it took to be a model for the new principality, and there was no new prince looming on the horizon. One opportunity had opened and closed, namely Cesare Borgia. But even his aleatory adventure, which has begun, successfully culminated in disaster due to the fate whims of fortune. And now, as a conclusion, few words on, as I call, materialist political theory. I think that Althusser's interpretation of Machiavelli and Althusser's concept of the aleatory nature of politics and aleatory interpretation of Machiavelli are significant contributions to political theory. Althusser outlines his notion of an aleatory Machiavelli, and with the help of Epicurean tradition, also a theory of materialist politics that open up a view of politics as an action occurring in a conjuncture where each actor aims to organize and govern the effective truth. How to govern realtà, verità effettuale. But where no single party can ever be certain about a victory. And each victory can only be temporary. It also includes, as I mentioned, some kind of principle of hope that each victory is only temporary. I think that in Machiavelli it's important also to notice that in the state of victory, in the moment of triumph, there is also possibility for change. You know this model. Even every fixed political form of organization rests on an uncertain aleatory foundation. This so-called aleatory logic indeed refers to the fact that there is a struggle at the center of politics. There is a struggle at the center of politics, whereas the state of peace is a displaced form of struggle. State of peace is a displaced form of struggle. Therefore, The Althusserian theory of politics, and maybe his interpretation of the prince, is the theory of struggles and conflicts characterized by displacements and condensations within the effective truth. This does not mean, however, that political action could not strive for a world better than the existing one. On the contrary, Althusser was interested in how the revolutionary political movement should operate in order for its strategy to be both effective and utopian. And I think there is some similarity between Althusser and Gramsci's The Modern Prince. As Althusser shows in the case of Machiavelli, utopia does not, however, refer to the construction of an abstract ideal society, but to a political goal, the attainment of which requires a theoretical analysis of the historical conjuncture and the political action that effectively utilizes and adapts the conditions of the conjuncture. Thank you.
So we have some time for discussion before the close of the conference. So another question?
After all this theory, I shall make a very empirical point. Last year or so, I was invited to talk at a conference on whether the Medici were signori of Florence or not. And at the end, a vote was taken by the chairman, how many thought one thing or the other. And someone said, yes, I'd been misinterpreted. And in fact, what I was arguing for was that it was neither a lord or a republic, but it was someone who'd hold the balance between the two, because this is the language that everyone was talking about at the time. It was an arbitro, someone who could stand between the two forces. And at intervals during this conference, people seem to have wondered whether we're talking about a dualism, either republic or a monarchy, or whether we're talking about three forces, something outside the two. And I was interested too that Guicciardini talks about the need for a sopracapo, which is interesting. I think you mentioned the word what did you say, Machiavelli? A super head, I think. No one, I think, has mentioned Hobbes's marvelous image on the cover of the Leviathan of the monarch who consists of all the people. So I'm just wondering, I mean, as a sort of my concluding thought, whether we shouldn't be worrying too much about whether it's a republic or a principality, but whether we shouldn't be thinking, as I think people were thinking at the time, that there was need for a sopracapo, a third force, or someone who would exercise power, which was neither of the two forms. And this may fit in with the necessary sort of innovation that we obviously all recognize in the prince. So it's not exactly a question, but it's asking for your comment.
I started wondering that sopracapo would be capo come il duce, or some dictator. And there is risk that this third force is not some progressive force. I don't know if I get your argument, but anyhow. But back to the Althusser's interpretation, or Gramsci's also, I think so, on Machiavelli, I started thinking about this question of durability of state, and it's founding a state as a form of law, or buoni ordini. And it's not depends on this republic, principate, or other form of state. This has been a very important question in Finnish history because in the 19th century, Finland was an autonomous part of Russian Empire. We have our own laws and our own inner state, not state as a form of foreign policy. And our so-called most famous philosopher, so-called nationalist philosopher was Snellman, Hegelian, but also very interested in French Enlightenment thinking. I have written in Finland a book on Snellman, so it's very near my interest. Snellman said, like so many other thinkers, like Hegel in Germany, that it's not a question about form of state. It depends on is there any occasion for some form of state or not. It's dependent on context. But it's most important question is the state good or bad? I think this is very Aristotelian view also, because for Aristotle, I think it wasn't the most important thing, was it aristocracy or some other form of state, but was it for or against people?
I appreciated your presentation above all because for me it made clear how many analogies there are between Gramsci's and Althusser's interpretation of Machiavelli, but also how many differences. Yeah. So, for example, the whole question of the foundation, of the first moment, of the discrepancy between the one who founds the city and the people, no, and the many, the multitude that maintains the city, there is in Gramsci, this plays in Gramsci's interpretation of Machiavelli any role. So it would be very interesting for me if you could explain, if you could make some reflection, some further reflections between the different approaches. I mean the philosophical approaches, no? The philosophical difference that there is between Gramsci's and Althusser's approach to Machiavelli.
This is very interesting question, and maybe we can organize a full seminar comparing Althusser and Gramsci. Because maybe this is too long answer, but I must say that we have two kinds of Althusserians. Those who think that Althusser is so different than Gramsci, and people like me, and for example in England Stuart Hall, who think that there are so many different similar things in Gramsci and between Gramsci and Althusser. But concerning Machiavelli, I must say on the other side that Althusser was an academic philosopher. And he is very philosophical when he analyzes, for example, The Prince. His analysis philosophical in academic sense. He sets questions. He goes class struggle in theory. But Gramsci's class struggle is in practice. And the theory is a part of political practice for Gramsci. For Gramsci, there is a question of relationship between buon senso or Marxist or some other intellectual systematic thinking and common sense, senso comune. For Gramsci, I think that to differentia specifica in the Gramsci's thinking in the Marxist tradition, inside the Marxist tradition, is that reflection of relationship between buon senso and senso comune. And, for example, how the theoretical thinking, also, for example, reading of Machiavelli or the thinking of Modern Prince, could form a part of senso comune of ordinary people. What is the role of scientific or reflective thinking in ordinary life? in the life of working classes, not only in the life of those people working inside École Normale Supérieure.
Any final reflections? A final round of thanks for all of the organizers of the conference, Filippo and Tanya and Vittorio and Fabio and everybody who's assisted in the conference over the weekend, particularly the people from media services here at Brunel who have ensured that your infamies and crimes have been immortalized for all time on the newly launched Machiavelli website. So thank you to all organizers.